A man dying of tuberculosis in a freezing Scottish farmhouse races to finish his final manuscript. His fingers are so weak he can barely hold the pen. Every cough brings up blood. He knows he has months left, maybe weeks, but he keeps writing because the book, his last warning to the world, isn't done yet. The year is 1948, and George Orwell is creating 1984, a novel that will define how we think about totalitarianism, surveillance, and truth itself. But he won't live to see its full impact. The man who wrote it wasn't always George Orwell. That name was an invention, a disguise. He was born Eric Arthur Blair in 1903 in Bengal, India, where his father worked in the opium department of the Indian Civil Service. Yes, opium. The British Empire ran a massive drug trade, growing opium in India and selling it to China, and Eric's father was a minor bureaucrat in that system. The family wasn't wealthy. They were what Orwell would later call lower upper middle class, that peculiar English category of people with social status but no money. When Eric was 1 year old, his mother took him and his older sister back to England. His father stayed in India, a distant figure Eric barely knew. They settled in Henley-on-Thames, a respectable town where respectability was all they could afford. The house was modest, the food was plain, but appearances mattered desperately. Eric's mother, Ida Blair, was obsessed with maintaining their social position despite their poverty. They had a servant, not because they could afford one, but because not having one would be unthinkable. This contradiction, this gap between what his family pretended to be and what they actually were, marked Eric for life. He grew up acutely aware of class, of the invisible lines that separated people, of the performance required to maintain status. At 8 years old, he was sent to a preparatory school called St. Cyprian's on the south coast of England. It was the kind of school designed to prepare boys for Eton or Harrow, the elite institutions that led to Oxford or Cambridge, and then to running the empire. Eric hated every minute of it. The school was run by a husband and wife team, the boys nicknamed Flip and Sambo. Flip was the real power, a social climber who favoured the wealthy students and treated the scholarship boys, Eric among them, with open contempt. Years later, Orwell would write an essay about St. Cyprian's called Such Were the Joys, and it's one of the most savage accounts of childhood misery ever written. He describes the constant beatings, the public humiliations, the way Flip would remind him that his parents were making sacrifices to send him there, that he was ungrateful, that he was dirty and smelly and would never amount to anything. Whether Orwell's account is entirely accurate or coloured by adult resentment is debatable, but what matters is how he remembered it, as a system designed to break children into accepting hierarchy, to teach them their place. The scholarship boys learned they were inferior, the wealthy boys learned they were superior. Everyone learned to obey. Despite the misery, Eric was a brilliant student. He won a scholarship to Eton, the most prestigious school in England. This should have been a triumph. Instead, it was more complicated. At Eton, he was surrounded by boys whose families owned estates, who had titles, who would inherit seats in Parliament. Eric had nothing. His father had finally retired from India, and the family was living on a tiny pension. The gap between Eric and his classmates was vast and unbridgeable. But something unexpected happened at Eton. The school, perhaps because it was so secure in its own status, was surprisingly tolerant. Eric was allowed to be eccentric. He read widely, everything from Shaw to Zola. He became a socialist, or at least started questioning the entire system he'd been raised to join. He stopped working. His grades were mediocre. He seemed to be deliberately sabotaging his chance at Oxford or Cambridge. When he graduated in 1921, he did something shocking for an Eton boy. He joined the Indian Imperial Police and went to Burma. Not to university, not to a respectable career in London, but to be a colonial policeman in the far reaches of the empire. His family was baffled. His teachers were disappointed. Why would someone throw away an Eton education for this? The answer wouldn't become clear for years. Eric spent 5 years in Burma from 1922 to 1927, and they destroyed something in him. He was a policeman in an occupied country, enforcing British rule over people who despised him. He was 19 years old, 6'2", gangly and awkward, and he was given a rifle and authority over a population that outnumbered the British thousands to 1. In his essay, Shooting an Elephant, Orwell describes an incident where he was called to deal with an elephant in musth, a periodic condition that makes elephants violent. The elephant had killed a man. When Orwell arrived, the elephant was calm, eating grass. There was no danger, but a crowd of Burmese had gathered, 2,000 people waiting to see what the white officer would do. And Orwell realised he had to shoot the elephant, not because it was dangerous, but because not shooting it would make him look weak. The crowd expected a performance of imperial authority, and he had to deliver. He shot the elephant. It took half an hour to die. Orwell fired shot after shot into its body while it bled and struggled and finally collapsed. He did it, he writes, solely to avoid looking like a fool. That moment crystallized everything wrong with imperialism for him. The system didn't just oppress the Burmese, it trapped the oppressors too, forced them to perform cruelty to maintain the illusion of control. The guilt ate at him. He saw prisoners beaten, he attended hangings, he raided villages, he enforced laws he didn't believe in. Every day, he saw the machinery of empire up close, the violence required to keep it running, the casual racism of his fellow officers who genuinely believed they were civilizing savages. And he participated. He was complicit. In 1927, while on leave in England, he resigned. He gave no clear explanation to his family. He simply said he was done. His parents were horrified. He'd thrown away Eton, and now he was throwing away a secure career with a pension. What was he planning to do? Eric didn't know. He just knew he needed to atone. The guilt from Burma was overwhelming, and he decided the only way to purge it was to go in the opposite direction, to experience poverty himself, to live among the people at the very bottom of the social system he'd been trained to administer. This wasn't research, it was penance. He moved to the East End of London and deliberately made himself poor. He dressed in ragged clothes, stopped shaving, and went to live in doss houses, the cheap lodging houses where the homeless and destitute slept. He tramped around London and the countryside with vagrants. He worked as a dishwasher in Paris, living in a slum hotel, barely eating. He was trying to erase Eric Blair, the Eton boy, the colonial policeman, and become someone else. His first book, Down and Out in Paris and London, published in 1933, came from this period. It's not a novel, it's a documentary account of poverty, written with clear-eyed detail. He describes the exhaustion of washing dishes for 17 hours in a sweltering basement kitchen. He describes the bugs in the mattresses, the stink of unwashed bodies, the constant hunger. He describes a world most of his readers had never seen. And he does it without sentimentality or melodrama, just the facts. And that's where the name George Orwell appears for the first time. Eric Blair thought his family would be embarrassed by the book, so he chose a pseudonym. He suggested 4 options to his publisher, and they picked George Orwell. George was a common English name, patriotic and solid. The Orwell was a river in Suffolk he'd loved as a child. The name stuck. For the rest of his life, his friends would be split between those who called him Eric and those who called him George. But to the world, he was Orwell. The book didn't sell well, but it established him as a writer with a distinct voice, someone who could make the invisible visible. He started writing novels, but they were strange, uncomfortable books. Burmese Days drew directly on his time in Burma, a bitter portrait of colonial corruption. A clergyman's daughter followed a woman's mental breakdown and descent into poverty. Keep the Aspidistra Flying was about a man who rejects middle-class respectability and chooses poverty out of principle, only to discover that poverty is miserable and dignity requires money. None of these books sold well. Orwell was barely making a living. He took a job in a bookshop in Hampstead, a respectable London neighbourhood, spending his days selling books to middle-class customers and his evenings writing in a tiny flat. He was 30 years old, unknown, struggling, still trying to figure out what kind of writer he was. Then, in 1936, everything changed. The publisher Victor Gollancz commissioned Orwell to investigate unemployment in the industrial north of England. The Depression had devastated the mining towns, and Gollancz wanted a book about it. Orwell went to Yorkshire and Lancashire, spending months living in miners' homes, going down into the mines, documenting the conditions. What he produced was The Road to Wigan Pier, and it's unlike anything he'd written before. The first half is straight reportage, describing the poverty, the overcrowded houses, the diet of bread and margarine and tea, the unemployment that destroyed men's sense of purpose. Orwell calculates the exact nutritional content of working-class meals and concludes they're slowly starving. He describes the mines with geological precision, the seams of coal only 2 feet high that miners have to crawl through, the heat, the darkness, the danger. But the second half of the book turns into something else entirely. Orwell starts examining socialism itself, the movement that claimed to represent these workers. And he's brutal. He attacks middle-class socialists, the comfortable intellectuals who talk about the working class, but recoil from actual workers. He describes the sandal wearers and bearded fruit juice drinkers who make socialism seem like a cranky health cult. He admits his own class prejudice, confessing that he was taught from childhood that working-class people smell. The honesty was shocking. This was supposed to be a pro-socialist book commissioned by a left-wing publisher. Instead, Orwell was attacking his own side, pointing out that the socialist movement was full of people who didn't actually like workers, who were motivated more by hatred of the rich than love of the poor. Gollancz published it, but included a nervous foreword, distancing himself from the second half. The book made Orwell's reputation. Suddenly he was being taken seriously, not just as a writer, but as a political thinker. He'd found his subject, the gap between what political movements claimed to stand for and what they actually did, the way ideology distorted reality, the importance of looking clearly at uncomfortable truths. And then, just as his career was finally taking off, he did something that seemed designed to destroy it. In December 1936, Orwell left England and went to Spain to fight in a war. Spain was tearing itself apart, and Orwell walked straight into the fire. In July 1936, General Francisco Franco had launched a military coup against Spain's elected Republican government. The coup failed to take Madrid, and the country split. Fascist nationalists controlled the south and west. Republicans held the east and north. What followed was a civil war that became a rehearsal for World War II, with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy backing Franco, and Soviet Russia backing the Republicans. For intellectuals across Europe, Spain became the defining cause. Fascism had to be stopped. Democracy had to be defended. Thousands of foreign volunteers travelled to Spain to fight. The international brigades formed, organised by communists, but filled with idealists from dozens of countries. Orwell arrived in Barcelona just after Christmas, 1936. He was 33 years old, tall, thin, with no military training beyond his brief time in the Burma police. His plan was vague. He'd get some material for articles, maybe see some fighting, then come home. He had a letter of introduction from the Independent Labour Party, a small British socialist group. Barcelona in December 1936 was unlike anything Orwell had seen. The revolution had come. Anarchists and socialists controlled the city. Class distinctions had been abolished overnight. Waiters and shopkeepers refused tips, calling everyone comrade. Luxury restaurants had been collectivized. Churches stood burned and empty. Red and black anarchist flags hung from every building. Orwell was overwhelmed. It was the first time I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle, he wrote later. Tipping was forbidden. The word "senya" had disappeared, replaced by comrade or thou. Even bootblacks had been collectivized. There was a belief in the air, a genuine sense that human society could be remade from the ground up. He joined the militia of the POM, a small Marxist party aligned with the Independent Labour Party. Not the communists, not the mainstream socialists, but a revolutionary group that believed in workers' control and distrusted Stalin. This choice would nearly cost him his life, though he didn't know it yet. The POM sent him to the Aragon Front, a quiet sector facing nationalist positions in the hills. This was not the romantic war Orwell might have imagined. It was cold, boring, and absurd. The trenches were frozen, supplies were non-existent. His unit had antiquated rifles from 1896 and almost no ammunition. They spent weeks staring at fascist positions 400 yards away, occasionally exchanging shots but mostly just freezing. Orwell was put in command of a group of young Spaniards and some British volunteers. None of them had proper training. They didn't even have enough rifles to go around. At night, they huddled around fires and Orwell tried to teach basic military discipline to teenagers who'd never held a weapon before. The conditions were medieval. Lice infested everyone. The food was terrible, mostly beans and occasional bits of meat. Water had to be carried up from villages miles away. Men got sick constantly. Orwell developed a poisoned hand from a cut that wouldn't heal, but something about the experience moved him profoundly. These working-class Spanish kids, poorly armed and worse supplied, believed they were building a new world. They called each other comrade and meant it. There was no saluting, no officer class, no hierarchy beyond what was necessary for fighting. It was socialism, as Orwell had imagined it should be. Not a theory in a book, but a lived reality. Then he got shot. It was May 1937. Orwell had been at the front for months. His unit was in the trenches near Huesca, a nationalist-held town they'd been besieging with no success. Dawn was breaking. Orwell stood up to talk to a comrade. A fascist sniper, 400 yards away, fired a single shot. The bullet hit Orwell in the throat, passing through his neck and just missing his carotid artery. He went down, unable to speak, blood filling his mouth. His first thought was that he was dying. The pain came later. They carried him to a field hospital, then to another hospital further back, then to Barcelona. The bullet had damaged his vocal cords. For weeks he could barely whisper. Doctors told him he might never speak normally again. His left arm was partially paralysed. Lying in a Barcelona hospital, Orwell assumed his war was over. He'd go home, write about what he'd seen, recover. He had no idea that while he'd been at the front, the revolution had started eating itself. The Republican side was fracturing. The communists, backed by Stalin and Soviet weapons, wanted centralized control and a conventional army. The anarchists and POM wanted to continue the revolution, maintaining workers' control and the militia system. The argument wasn't just tactical. It was about what kind of society they were fighting for. In early May, while Orwell was still at the front, street fighting broke out in Barcelona. The communists and government forces attacked anarchist and POM positions. For 3 days, Spanish Republicans fought each other in the streets. Hundreds died. The communists won. They took control of Barcelona and began a purge. The POM was declared a fascist organization, which was insane. These were Marxists who'd been fighting Franco for months, but Stalin had ordered the destruction of all independent leftist groups. Trotsky had been expelled from Russia, and anyone associated with anti-Stalinist Marxism was now an enemy. POM members started disappearing. They were arrested, tortured, executed. The Soviet secret police operated openly in Barcelona, hunting down anyone on their lists. The international press, especially communist papers, ran stories claiming the POM had been working for Franco all along, that they were traitors and spies. Orwell returned to Barcelona in June, still recovering from his wound, and walked into a nightmare. His friends were in hiding. The poem had been outlawed, hotels were being raided, anyone associated with the party was being arrested. He tried to help. He and his wife Eileen, who'd come to Spain to work in the Paum office, went looking for one of their comrades, George Kopp, a Belgian engineer who'd fought beside Orwell. They found out he'd been arrested and thrown into a secret prison. No charges, no trial, just disappeared. Orwell and Eileen stayed in Barcelona for days, trying to get Kopp released, knowing that at any moment they could be arrested themselves. They slept in different places each night, avoided their hotel, kept moving. Finally, they managed to get the right papers and cross into France. They were safe. But the experience had shattered something in Orwell's understanding of the left. These were not fascists who'd betrayed the revolution. But these were communists, people who claimed to be fighting for the workers, who were torturing and murdering other socialists. The Soviet Union, supposedly the workers' state, was acting exactly like a totalitarian dictatorship. And the Western press, the liberal papers Orwell had once trusted, were printing obvious lies, calling the poem traitors when they were nothing of the kind. Back in England, Orwell tried to tell the truth about what had happened. He wrote Homage to Catalonia, a book about his time in Spain. It described the beauty of the revolution in Barcelona, the courage of the militia, and then the betrayal, the street fighting, the purge, the lies. Almost no one wanted to publish it. The left didn't want to hear criticism of the Soviet Union, not when fascism was the real enemy. The right didn't care about a socialist's complaints. When the book finally came out in 1938, it sold fewer than 1,500 copies. Orwell had discovered something that would define the rest of his work. The enemy wasn't just capitalism or fascism. It was lying, the deliberate distortion of reality for political purposes. He'd watched it happen in real time. Events he'd witnessed personally were being described in newspapers as the opposite of what actually occurred. History was being rewritten while it was still happening. He'd seen revolution devour its own children. He'd watched idealism turn into terror. And he'd learned that totalitarianism could come from the left just as easily as the right, that the desire for absolute power wore many different uniforms. Spain had radicalized him, but not in the way you'd expect. He didn't become more extreme. He became more committed to truth, to the importance of facing reality even when reality was uncomfortable, even when it meant criticizing your own side. The bullet that went through his neck should have killed him. Instead, it taught him what he needed to write about for the rest of his life. While Orwell recovered in England, his voice permanently damaged, his worldview fundamentally altered, Europe was sliding toward catastrophe. Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland. Mussolini had conquered Ethiopia. Japan was invading China. The Spanish Republic was losing, slowly strangled by Franco's forces and abandoned by the democracies that had refused to help. Orwell watched it all with growing horror. The pattern was clear. Fascism was expanding. The democracies were too weak or too frightened to resist, and the left was tearing itself apart with ideological purges and delusional thinking. He kept writing, but now with a new urgency. His target wasn't just poverty or injustice, it was intellectual dishonesty, the ways people refused to see what was in front of them, the ways political commitment made people stupid. Homage to Catalonia had failed commercially, but it established Orwell's reputation among those who read it carefully. Here was a writer who'd actually fought, who'd been shot, who still believed in socialism, but refused to lie about what the communists were doing. He wrote essays savaging the intellectual left for their worship of Soviet Russia. He attacked pacifists for not understanding that sometimes you had to fight. He went after everyone, left and right, who he thought was lying or deluding themselves. His health was deteriorating. The wound had damaged his lungs. He started coughing, struggling with what he thought was bronchitis, but was probably the beginning of tuberculosis. Money was still tight. He was respected now, but not successful. not commercially. Then in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The catastrophe Orwell had seen coming finally arrived. He tried to enlist immediately. The war had to be fought, fascism had to be stopped, but the army rejected him. His lungs were too damaged. His height, 6'2", made him a perfect target. His general health was poor. Orwell was furious. He was only 36 years old. He'd already fought in one war. Now the most important war in history was starting, and he couldn't join. Instead, he joined the Home Guard, the civilian defense force training to resist a German invasion. He drilled with ancient rifles in the English countryside, preparing for battles that never came. It was absurd and frustrating, but at least it was something. London started burning. The Blitz began in September 1940, German bombers attacking night after night. Orwell and Eileen stayed in the city, watching buildings collapse, seeing the East End devastated, living through the constant sirens and explosions. He got a job at the BBC, broadcasting propaganda to India. It was steady work, decent pay, and he hated it. He was writing scripts promoting the British war effort to Indians who had every reason to hate British imperialism. The hypocrisy burned, but he needed the money, and the war had to be won. So he wrote his scripts, broadcast his talks, and felt himself becoming the thing he'd always fought against. A propagandist distorting truth for political purposes. At night, after his BBC shifts, he'd go home to his tiny apartment and work on something else. A novel. An idea that had been forming since Spain. Since he'd watched history being rewritten and truth being murdered. He'd seen the future. He knew what was coming if totalitarianism won. Not just in Germany or Russia, but everywhere. The boots stamping on the human face forever. And he was going to write it down. The novel started taking shape in his mind during those strange wartime years at the BBC. He'd arrive at Broadcasting House, walk past the sandbags and bomb damage, take the elevator to his office, and spend 8 hours producing what he privately called propaganda for the coolie countries. Then he'd go home and write something true. The working title was The Last Man in Europe. It was about a future Britain, or somewhere like Britain, where the party controlled everything. History, language, thought itself. Where 2 + 2 could equal 5 if the party said so. Where the past was constantly rewritten and truth didn't exist outside political power. Spain had shown him how it worked. The suppression of the May events in Barcelona. The lies about the POUM. The Stalinist press calling anarchists and socialists fascists. Rewriting battles that hadn't happened. Erasing people who'd been murdered. Orwell had watched journalists he knew write reports about events they hadn't witnessed, describing battles that never occurred. He'd seen photographs doctored, speeches altered, facts simply inverted, and people believed it. Or they pretended to believe it, which was almost worse. The intellectuals back in London had swallowed the party line completely. They denied the purges were happening, then justified them, then denied they'd ever denied them. Reality became whatever served the cause. The BBC work reinforced everything. He was part of the machine now, crafting narratives, shaping facts, selling a version of Britain to people who knew the empire had crushed them for centuries. The irony was acid in his throat. But what choice was there? Hitler had to be stopped. The war was necessary. Sometimes propaganda was necessary. The contradiction ate at him. How do you fight totalitarianism without becoming totalitarian? How do you defeat an enemy that controls information by controlling information yourself? There had to be some core of truth you refused to surrender. Some line you wouldn't cross. That's what the novel was about. Not just political systems, but the human capacity to hold on to reality when power wanted to reshape it. Winston Smith, his protagonist, worked at the Ministry of Truth rewriting history. Just like Orwell rewrote reality at the BBC. But Winston remembered. He knew 2 + 2 = 4 even when the party said otherwise. That stubborn insistence on objective truth, that refusal to let power determine reality, that was everything. In 1943, Orwell's mother died. He felt it more than he'd expected. The complicated relationship, the years of distance, the class tensions that had shaped his entire life. She'd never quite understood what he was doing, why he'd thrown away his opportunities, why he lived in poverty writing books nobody bought. His father had died 3 years earlier. Orwell had barely reacted then. The old man had been a stranger, really, distant, disappointed, embodying everything about the imperial system that Orwell had rejected. But his mother's death opened something. He was 40 years old, in poor health, with no children, doing work he despised while the world burned around him. Eileen wanted a child. They'd been trying for years without success, so they decided to adopt. In June 1944, just after D-Day, they brought home a 3-week-old boy. They named him Richard Horatio Blair. Suddenly, impossibly, Orwell was a father. The timing was absurd. He was 41, broke, working constant hours at the BBC, writing essays and reviews on the side to make rent, coughing more every month. Eileen was exhausted, working her own job at the Ministry of Food, managing a household under wartime rationing, now caring for an infant. But Richard changed something. Orwell had written about children before, about protecting the future, about fighting so the next generation could live in a better world. Now he had an actual child, a specific future he'd never see. The novel he was writing took on new weight. This was the world Richard would inherit if totalitarianism won. He needed to finish it. The BBC job was strangling him, consuming time and energy he needed for real work. In November 1943, he'd quit, going back to freelance poverty, but gaining his time back. Now he wrote constantly, reviews and essays during the day, the novel at night. Animal Farm came first. He'd finished it in early 1944, a short satirical fable about the Russian Revolution told through farm animals. The pigs take over, promising equality, then become indistinguishable from the humans they'd overthrown. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It was his clearest, sharpest attack on Soviet communism yet, and nobody would publish it. Victor Gollancz rejected it immediately. Faber and Faber rejected it, T.S. Eliot himself writing the rejection letter, explaining that the allegory was too obvious and too negative toward Russia, Britain's ally. Jonathan Cape was ready to publish until someone at the Ministry of Information suggested it wasn't the right time. The censorship was informal, polite, and absolute. No official ban existed. Publishers just independently decided that criticizing Stalin while Britain and Russia were allied against Hitler wasn't appropriate. Orwell was being silenced by good manners and political convenience. He kept trying, rejection after rejection. The manuscript sat in his desk drawer while he wrote essays and reviews to pay rent. Finally, Frederick Warburg, a small publisher willing to take risks, agreed to print it. But paper was rationed during wartime. The book would have to wait until after victory. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Hitler was dead, Germany defeated, the concentration camps liberated. Orwell felt relief but not joy. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan in August, ended the Pacific War but opened a new horror. The weapon that could destroy cities in seconds now existed, and the Americans had it. Worse, the alliance with Russia was already fracturing. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was still a year away, but anyone paying attention could see it coming. Eastern Europe was being swallowed. The Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all falling under Soviet control. The totalitarianism they'd fought against in its Nazi form was now spreading in its communist form. Animal Farm finally appeared in August 1945. It sold out immediately. Orwell had written 16 years of failure and poverty. Now, suddenly, he had a success. The book struck exactly the right moment. People were ready to hear criticism of Stalin. The wartime alliance was dissolving. The intellectual class was starting to admit what Orwell had been saying since Spain. The reviews were extraordinary. The sales kept growing. American publishers competed for it. Orwell made real money for the first time in his life. He was 42 years old and finally solvent, but Eileen wasn't there to see it. In March 1945, she'd gone into the hospital for a routine operation, a hysterectomy. Orwell visited her the day before, brought her flowers, told her he'd see her when she woke up. During the surgery, she died under anesthesia. Heart failure. She was 39. Orwell was destroyed. They'd been married 9 years. She'd supported him through everything. The poverty, the failed books, Spain, the war years. She'd wanted success for him more than he'd wanted it for himself. Now it had finally come, and she was gone. He was alone with a 1-year-old child, suddenly successful but broken, coughing constantly, and he knew his lungs were failing. The tuberculosis he'd been ignoring for years was advancing. He didn't have much time. The novel had to be finished. He rented a house on Jura, a remote island off the Scottish coast. Isolated, cold, impossibly far from London, but it had clean air, space to work, and distance from everything. He brought Richard, hired a nanny, and threw himself into writing. The conditions on Jura were brutal. The house was primitive, freezing in winter, miles from the nearest village. Getting supplies meant a long boat journey. His health deteriorated steadily. He coughed up blood. His sister Avril came to help with Richard and the household, but Orwell was clearly dying. He worked anyway, every morning, every afternoon, pushing through fever and exhaustion. The novel consumed him. Winston Smith's world took shape, the grey, depressing London of Airstrip 1. The telescreen watching every movement. The thought police, room 101. He wrote the torture scenes, O'Brien breaking Winston, forcing him to deny reality, to accept that 2 + 2 = 5. He wrote Julia's betrayal, Winston's betrayal, the final victory of the party. He wrote the appendix on Newspeak, the systematic destruction of language itself to make certain thoughts impossible. The ending was absolute. No hope, no resistance, no redemption. Winston wins no victory. He learns to love Big Brother. The boot stamps on his face and he's grateful for it. Orwell refused the consolation of a heroic defeat or a hint that the system might someday fall. Critics would later ask why he made it so dark, so hopeless. He'd explain that it wasn't prophecy, it was warning. This is what happens if we lose. This is what the world becomes if totalitarianism wins completely. You have to see it clearly to fight it. By early 1948, the manuscript was complete. Orwell was severely ill, his weight down to barely 100 pounds, coughing constantly, running fevers. He needed to get the book to his publisher, but retyping the entire manuscript was beyond him. He did it anyway, pecking at the typewriter between coughing fits, working through pain and exhaustion. The original title, The Last Man in Europe, was too bleak for his publisher. They needed something catchier. Orwell suggested reversing the last 2 digits of the year, 1948 becoming 1984. It sounded futuristic, ominous, and near enough to feel threatening. 1984 was published in June 1949. The impact was immediate and seismic. This wasn't Animal Farm's satirical fable. This was a full nightmare, detailed and visceral. Readers were horrified and fascinated. The book climbed bestseller lists. Critics called it important, terrifying, essential. But the interpretation started immediately, and many of them missed what Orwell intended. The right wing claimed it was purely an attack on socialism. The left argued he'd betrayed the cause. The CIA would later use it as anti-communist propaganda. Everyone wanted to claim the book for their side. Orwell was too sick to fight these readings. By the time 1984 appeared, he was in a sanatorium, dying of tuberculosis. He'd known for months it was terminal. The doctors tried various treatments, none effective. He lay in bed, lungs failing, reading reviews of his final book. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. The warning was delivered. The boot stamping on the human face forever was now in the cultural imagination. People had language for what he'd seen coming. Big Brother, doublethink, thought crime, newspeak. But he was 45 years old, with a 5-year-old son he'd barely see grow up. The success had come too late. The books that would define his legacy, Animal Farm and 1984, arrived in his final years when he was too sick to enjoy them. He proposed marriage to Sonia Brownell, an editorial assistant at Horizon magazine, from his hospital bed. She accepted. They married in October 1949, Orwell in pyjamas, barely able to sit up. She was 30, he was dying. The marriage was partly practical, ensuring she'd control his estate and look after Richard. But there was affection too, a strange, desperate connection in his final months. He tried to keep working. He dictated notes for essays. He planned another novel. The doctors said he might have years if he went to a sanatorium in Switzerland. He made plans to go, hoping the mountain air might give him more time. On January 21st, 1950, an artery in his lungs burst. He drowned in his own blood, alone in his hospital room. He was 46 years old. Richard was not quite 6. The funeral was small, quiet, attended mostly by fellow writers and editors who'd known him in London's literary circles. Sonia, his widow of 3 months, stood at the graveside. His son Richard, too young to understand, was elsewhere. They buried him in a country churchyard in Sutton Courtenay, Oxfordshire, far from the Spanish trenches and the poverty of Paris, far from Burma's heat and Wigan's coal dust. The headstone was simple. Eric Arthur Blair, his real name, not the pseudonym that had made him famous. No mention of Orwell, no quotation from his work, just dates and a name most readers wouldn't recognise. The obituaries praised his integrity, his clarity, his moral vision. Some called him a prophet. Others insisted he'd been too pessimistic, too dark in his final book. The arguments over what he really meant had already begun and would never stop. Within weeks, the Cold War machinery started absorbing his work. The American government saw 1984 as the perfect anti-Soviet weapon. They funded translations, distributed copies behind the Iron Curtain, used Orwell's nightmare vision to illustrate communist tyranny. The CIA secretly bought the film rights to Animal Farm and produced an animated version that simplified the allegory into pure anti-Soviet propaganda, removing the ending's ambiguity where pigs and men become indistinguishable. This would have disgusted him. Orwell had spent his entire career fighting against the distortion of language for political ends, and now his own words were being twisted, simplified, weaponized by the very power structures he'd warned against. But dead writers can't control their legacies. The books became what readers needed them to be. In Britain, the left felt betrayed. How could a man who'd fought for socialism write such a despairing vision? Some claimed he'd been broken by illness, that 1984 was the product of a dying man's depression, not genuine political analysis. Others argued he'd always been a bourgeois sentimentalist, playing at revolution, never truly committed. The Communist Party, which had tried to kill him in Spain, dismissed him as a traitor and a liar. The right embraced him as one of their own, proof that socialism inevitably leads to tyranny. They ignored his democratic socialism, his lifelong advocacy for economic equality, his hatred of imperialism and capitalism's cruelties. They took 1984 and pretended Animal Farm's pigs represented all forms of collective organisation, not specifically Stalinist corruption. Orwell became a Cold War icon, stripped of nuance, but something else was happening too, something he might have appreciated. Ordinary readers, people outside political factions and ideological camps, were reading his books and finding in them something true about power itself. Not just Soviet power or fascist power, but the mechanisms of control that exist in any system where authority goes unchecked. Teachers assigned Animal Farm in schools. Teenagers read about Napoleon and Squealer and recognized patterns they'd seen in their own lives, smaller scale but structurally identical. The way rules change to benefit those in charge. The way language gets twisted until freedom is slavery starts to sound almost reasonable. The way history gets rewritten and everyone pretends not to notice. 1984 became a cultural reference point. Big Brother entered the language as shorthand for surveillance and control. People started noticing doublethink in political speeches, newspeak in corporate jargon, the memory hole in how inconvenient facts disappeared from public discussion. Orwell had given readers a vocabulary for recognizing manipulation, and that vocabulary proved useful far beyond the Soviet context he'd been thinking about. His essays started gaining recognition too. Politics and the English language became required reading for anyone trying to write clearly. His rules, never use a long word where a short one will do, if it's possible to cut a word out, always cut it out, became foundational principles. Shooting an Elephant appeared in anthologies, its meditation on imperialism and moral compromise resonating with new generations facing their own ethical dilemmas. The Spanish Civil War memoir Homage to Catalonia found its audience slowly. It had sold poorly when published, too honest about leftist infighting for most readers' taste. But by the 60s, as disillusionment with authoritarian communism spread through the Western left, people returned to Orwell's account and found something valuable. Here was someone who'd gone to Spain as a true believer and come back with his eyes open, refusing easy answers, insisting on complexity. The personal details of his life started emerging. Sonia, his widow, controlled the estate and initially resisted biography, protective of his privacy and perhaps her own. But gradually, the full picture came into focus. The poverty years in Paris and London, the bullet through the throat in Spain, the island isolation while writing 1984, sick and alone, racing death to finish the manuscript. People learned about his complicated relationships with women, his occasional cruelty, his capacity for pettiness, alongside his larger moral courage. The lists he'd made for the British government, naming suspected communist sympathisers, emerged decades later and caused scandal. How could Orwell, of all people, have informed on fellow writers? The context mattered. He was dying, frightened of Soviet expansion, trying to help what he saw as the democratic cause. But it looked like betrayal of his own principles, proof that even the most morally vigilant can compromise when scared. This made him more human, less icon. The man who'd written that saints should always be judged guilty until proven innocent had his own guilt. He'd lived his principles imperfectly, like everyone does. That didn't erase what he'd accomplished, but it complicated the legend. By the 1960s, a new generation discovered his work and found it spoke directly to their moment. The Vietnam War, with its body counts and strategic hamlets and pacification programs, its language designed to obscure horror, looked like something from Orwell's nightmare. Students read 1984 and Politics in the English Language and recognised their government's doublespeak. The counterculture embraced him as an ally, someone who'd seen through official lies and said so clearly. The surveillance state he'd imagined started becoming real, not through totalitarian revolution, but through technological creep. Computers made mass data collection possible. Security agencies expanded. The telescreen, Orwell's fictional device that watched while pretending to entertain, started looking less like fantasy and more like prophecy. Every few years, some new technology, closed-circuit cameras, internet tracking, smartphone location data, prompted journalists to invoke Orwell's name. He'd become the standard reference point for discussing privacy and control. In the Eastern Bloc, his books were banned, which guaranteed underground popularity. Samizdat copies of 1984 circulated in the Soviet Union, typed and retyped, passed hand to hand. Readers in Prague and Warsaw and Moscow read about Ingsoc and the party and recognized their own reality rendered with uncomfortable precision. The propaganda, the ideological rigidity, the fear of thought crime, it was all there. Orwell had never visited the Soviet Union, but he'd understood it perfectly. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, commentators noted the date, just 5 years after Orwell's imagined apocalypse. Some claimed he'd been wrong, that 1984's pessimism had been disproven by history. Totalitarianism hadn't won. The boot hadn't stamped forever. But others pointed out he'd never predicted inevitable totalitarian victory. He'd warned what could happen if people weren't vigilant, if they let language be corrupted and truth become relative and power concentrate without challenge. The warning had been heeded, at least partially, which is why the worst hadn't come to pass. The digital age brought new relevance. Social media platforms, with their algorithmic control of information, their ability to create separate realities for different users, their capacity for mass manipulation through targeted messaging. These started looking like the Ministry of Truth's update for the 21st century. Not government-run, but corporate-owned. Not overtly coercive, but subtly shaping perception. The mechanisms were different, but the effects similar. Reality itself became contested, facts negotiable, truth whatever your chosen sources claimed. Alternative facts entered political vocabulary in 2017, and everyone immediately thought of Orwell. Doublethink wasn't hypothetical anymore. People watched the same events and saw completely different things, not through natural disagreement, but through systematic information manipulation. The memory hole had become the internet's endless scroll, where yesterday's inconvenient statements could be deleted or drowned in noise. Orwell's definition of freedom, the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4, became a rallying cry in debates over objective reality. Can we agree on basic facts? Is there such a thing as truth independent of political allegiance? These questions, central to his work, defined contemporary discourse. His complicated relationship with socialism kept generating debate. Was he a socialist who critiqued authoritarianism from within the left, or had he abandoned socialism by the end? The text supports both readings depending on which works you emphasize. The Road to Wigan Pier and Homage to Catalonia show fierce commitment to economic justice and working-class dignity. 1984. And Animal Farm showed deep skepticism about revolutionary politics and collective organization. He contained contradictions because reality contains contradictions. What remained consistent was his commitment to truth-telling and clear language. Whatever his shifting political positions, he never stopped insisting that words matter, that clarity is a moral obligation, that writers have a duty to resist propaganda, whether from left or right. This made him frustrating to ideologues, but valuable to everyone else. His influence on other writers was immense. Every dystopian novel written after 1949 exists in 1984's shadow. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, they all engage with Orwell's vision, either extending it or arguing against it. He'd established the template for how to imagine totalitarian futures, and subsequent writers had to either follow or deliberately subvert his model. His essay style became the standard for political writing. The personal voice, the concrete details, the refusal of academic jargon, the insistence on moral clarity, these defined good political prose after Orwell. Writers like Christopher Hitchens and Joan Didion and James Baldwin all learned from his example, even when they disagreed with his conclusions. The centenary of his birth in 2003 brought renewed attention. Scholars reassessed his work. Biographers dug deeper into his life. Critics argued over his legacy. Some accused him of misogyny, pointing to his troubled relationships and occasional crude statements about women. Others defended him as a man of his time who still advocated for women's education and economic independence. The debate, like most debates about Orwell, revealed more about the debaters than about him. What became clear was that he couldn't be easily claimed by any faction. The socialist who hated Stalin, the anti-imperialist who loved English culture, the class-conscious Etonian who lived with tramps, the revolutionary who feared revolution, the dying man who wrote about the future. He was too contradictory for simple appropriation, which meant his work remained genuinely challenging rather than becoming comfortable propaganda. His warnings about technology and surveillance proved more relevant with each passing decade. Facial recognition software, predictive policing, social credit systems in authoritarian states. The apparatus of control kept expanding in ways he'd imagined. The telescreen was now voluntary. People carried it willingly, checking their phones constantly, broadcasting their locations and thoughts and relationships to corporate servers. The surveillance wasn't imposed from above, but emerged from below, and that made it more insidious. Yet people still resisted. Every time some new intrusion on privacy was revealed, someone invoked Orwell. Every time political language became too twisted, someone pointed to his essays. His work had become part of the immune system of democratic societies, a way of recognizing and naming threats to freedom. That was his legacy, not predictions but vocabulary, not prophecy but warning. The questions he'd asked remained urgent. What is truth? How do we resist manipulation? When does political necessity justify moral compromise? How do we maintain human decency in systems designed to crush it? These weren't questions with final answers, which is why each generation had to grapple with them fresh. And behind all the political analysis and cultural influence stood the basic achievement. He'd written clearly about complicated things. He'd refused to lie even when lies were convenient. He'd looked at poverty and imperialism and war and totalitarianism and described what he actually saw, not what ideology demanded he see. That simplicity was deceptive. The clarity came from brutal revision, from crossing out everything fancy or vague until only the necessary remained. Sentences that looked effortless had been rewritten a dozen times. The plain style wasn't natural to him. It was achieved through discipline. His tuberculosis had shaped more than his body. Knowing he was dying changed how he wrote. Every word mattered because there weren't infinite words left. The urgency in his late work came from racing against physical collapse. He couldn't afford elaborate constructions or leisurely development. Get to the point, say it clearly, move on. This created prose with unusual density. Each paragraph in 1984 does multiple kinds of work simultaneously. It advances plot, develops character, explores political theory, and comments on language all at once. Most writers can't sustain that level of compression without becoming opaque. Orwell managed it by cutting everything that didn't serve multiple purposes. His essays demonstrated the method in its purest form. Take A Hanging, written about his time in Burma. 8 pages describing an execution. No explicit moralizing, just concrete details. A prisoner stepping aside to avoid a puddle on his way to the gallows. That single image contains the entire argument against capital punishment. The man's automatic care for his comfort, even moments before death, reveals his humanity more powerfully than any abstract argument could. Or consider Such Were the Joys, his memoir of boarding school. The essay is ostensibly about childhood, but it's really about class, about shame, about how institutions manufacture obedience. He describes being beaten for bedwetting, being told he was ungrateful and worthless, being made to feel his poverty was a moral failing. The specific memory becomes a window into how hierarchies reproduce themselves through psychological violence. This movement, from particular to universal, defined his best work. He never started with theory and looked for examples. He started with what he'd seen and let the implications emerge. The tramps in Down and Out weren't illustrations of poverty. They were specific men with names and stories. The Spanish militiaman in Homage to Catalonia wasn't a symbol of working-class heroism. He was an Italian volunteer with cracked boots, shaking hands in a freezing trench. The particularity made the politics convincing. His contemporaries often missed this. Intellectuals wanted grand theories and systematic philosophies. Orwell kept insisting on details. What did it smell like? How much did it cost? Who actually benefited? These questions seemed crude to people trading in abstractions, but they cut through endless amounts of sophisticated nonsense. The language itself embodied democratic values. If you write clearly, anyone can understand and challenge your argument. If you write obscurely, only specialists can engage, which creates an intellectual priesthood. Orwell was allergic to priesthoods. He wanted plumbers and shopkeepers to read his work and argue with him. That meant avoiding technical vocabulary and academic conventions. This occasionally made professional philosophers dismiss him as shallow. They'd point out that his arguments weren't rigorous by formal standards, that he didn't engage with epistemology or ontology properly. True enough, but he was doing something else. He was making political and moral questions accessible to people outside universities. That was more important than impressing academics. His influence on journalism was particularly significant. Before Orwell, political reporting mostly quoted officials and summarized positions. He demonstrated that a reporter could think, could analyze, could take moral stands while still being factual. The personal voice didn't compromise objectivity. It enabled it by acknowledging the writer's perspective, rather than hiding behind false neutrality. Modern long-form journalism owes him everything. The immersive reporting of someone like George Packer, the moral clarity of Rebecca Solnit, the attention to forgotten people in Barbara Ehrenreich's work, all of it flows from Orwell's example. Get close to your subject. Describe what you actually observe. Connect individual stories to larger patterns. Don't pretend you're not there. His essay, Politics and the English Language, became required reading in writing courses worldwide. The 6 rules at the end seemed simple. Never use a metaphor you're used to seeing in print. Never use a long word where a short one will do. If you can cut a word, cut it. Never use the passive where you can use the active. Never use jargon if you can think of an everyday equivalent. Break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. Students copied these rules into notebooks for decades, but the deeper point wasn't about style preferences. It was about the relationship between language and thought. Sloppy language enables sloppy thinking, which enables political deception. Clear writing forces clear thinking, which makes lies harder to hide. The style guide was actually a political program. His commitment to this program cost him. Publishers wanted him to soften criticisms, to remove offensive passages, to make his books more commercially viable. He usually refused. When Animal Farm was finally accepted after multiple rejections, the publisher suggested changing the pigs to something less controversial. Orwell said no. The pigs were the point. This stubbornness meant he never became wealthy. He lived comfortably in his final years from Animal Farm royalties, but he'd spent most of his life poor by choice and circumstance. The poverty wasn't romantic. It meant bad housing, inadequate heating, constant money anxiety, but it also kept him honest. He couldn't pretend to understand working-class life from a comfortable distance. He'd actually lived it. The tuberculosis that killed him had roots in that poverty. Years of inadequate nutrition, cold rooms, exhausting manual labour. His body was worn down before the disease took hold. In a sense, his commitment to living among the poor contributed to his early death. He knew this and accepted it. The experience was worth the cost. His son Richard grew up barely knowing him. Orwell was away during much of the adoption, then dying during Richard's early childhood. The boy's memories were fragmentary. A thin man in bed, coughing. Presents sent from the sanatorium. Then absence. Richard spent his life being asked about a father he couldn't really remember, expected to have insights into a man he'd known for less than 2 years. That absence haunted the legacy. Orwell had wanted a family, wanted to be a father, wanted the domestic happiness that kept eluding him. His work about totalitarianism emerged partly from thinking about what kind of world his son would inherit. The dedication of Animal Farm to his wife Eileen, who died before seeing the book published, carried weight he couldn't fully express. Everything he wrote in the final years was shadowed by loss. The personal struggles never overwhelmed the work, though. He kept writing through grief, through illness, through despair. The discipline held. Even when his hands could barely hold a pen, he was revising, cutting, clarifying. The work came first because the work mattered more than his comfort. This created a body of writing remarkable for its consistency. His early novels were weaker than the late ones, but even the apprentice work showed the same concerns: poverty, empire, language, truth. He was always writing about the same things, getting better at it over time. There was no radical break between young Orwell and mature Orwell, just steady development of the same core interests. Critics have spent decades arguing about what he really believed. Was he ultimately a socialist, a conservative, an anarchist? The answer is he was Orwell, a category of one. He took positions from various traditions and rejected others, creating a synthesis that didn't fit established labels. This frustrated people who wanted him as an ally but made his work more durable. He couldn't be reduced to talking points. His suspicion of all orthodoxies remained his defining characteristic. Show him any system claiming final answers, and he'd start looking for the lie. This made him difficult to work with, impossible to control, and absolutely essential. Someone had to ask the uncomfortable questions. Someone had to point out that the emperor had no clothes. He'd volunteered for that role and never abandoned it. The cost was isolation. He belonged to no party, no movement, no school. His friendships were complicated by his willingness to criticize anyone, including friends. People admired him, but often from a distance. Getting close meant being subjected to his uncompromising honesty, which was exhausting. Yet that honesty was precisely what made him valuable. In decades defined by propaganda and self-deception, he insisted on telling the truth as he saw it. Not the truth that served his side, but the truth that emerged from careful observation. This was rare enough to be revolutionary. His influence extended beyond writing into how people thought about thinking. The concept of Orwellian entered common usage, describing not just totalitarian control, but any situation where language was twisted to obscure reality. Calling something Orwellian was shorthand for, "This is manipulative, and we should resist it." He'd given people a tool for recognizing and naming deception. Educational institutions embraced him cautiously. 1984 became required reading in schools, which meant students encountered Big Brother and thought crime and doublethink at 14 or 15. Whether they understood the complexity was debatable. Many came away with a simplified version: totalitarianism, bad; freedom, good. Not wrong, but missing the deeper questions about how totalitarianism emerges and how individuals become complicit. The book's presence in curricula guaranteed its survival, but also risked dulling its impact. Anything taught in school becomes homework, loses its danger. Students read it because they had to, not because it was forbidden or challenging. The subversive text became the establishment text. Orwell might have found this ironic. Still, generational transmission mattered. Each new cohort discovered his work and found their own meaning. Teenagers in the 1960s read him differently than teenagers in the 1980s, who read him differently than teenagers in the 2000s. The text stayed the same, but the context shifted, creating new resonances. The digital age brought fresh relevance. When Edward Snowden revealed mass surveillance programs, 1984, sales spiked. People recognized the parallels immediately. The NSA wasn't Big Brother. The situation was more complicated, but Orwell's warnings about surveillance states suddenly felt less hypothetical. The telescreens were here, just distributed differently. Social media created new forms of groupthink and public shaming that resembled 2 minutes hate. Online mobs formed and dispersed, united by rage against designated enemies. The mechanics differed from what Orwell described, but the psychological pattern was similar. Collective fury as entertainment and social bonding. The manipulation of information became harder to track. In Orwell's version, the state controlled all records and simply rewrote history. In reality, information overload and competing narratives created confusion without centralized control. You didn't need a ministry of truth when everyone was drowning in contradictory claims. The effect was similar, though. People lost confidence in their ability to know what was real. His work offered no solutions to these problems. That wasn't the point. He diagnosed the disease, not prescribed the cure. Understanding the mechanisms of control was the first step. What came next was up to readers. The academic industry around Orwell grew enormous. Dissertations, biographies, critical studies, conferences. Scholars debated every aspect of his life and work. Some of this was illuminating. Much of it was academics talking to other academics in language Orwell would have despised. The irony was thick. The man who'd fought jargon and obscurity became the subject of dense theoretical analysis, full of jargon and obscurity. A few scholars tried to write about him in his own style. Clear, direct, focused on what he actually said rather than what theory claimed he meant. These were the most valuable contributions. They honoured his methods by imitating them, something more meaningful than praise. His grave in Sutton Courtenay remained simple. No monument, just a headstone with his birth name Eric Blair and the dates. People visited occasionally, left flowers, paid respects. The modesty suited him. He'd never wanted to be worshipped, just read and considered seriously. The question of what Orwell would have made of the 21st century became a popular parlour game. Writers and commentators regularly invoked him, claiming he'd predicted this or warned about that. Most of these claims were lazy. Orwell wasn't a prophet. He was an analyst working with the materials of his time, extrapolating from trends he observed. Some extrapolations proved prescient, others didn't. He'd imagined a world where 3 superstates fought endless wars over disputed territories while maintaining rigid control at home. Reality turned out messier. Borders shifted, alliances changed, power dispersed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The Cold War fit his model reasonably well for 4 decades, then collapsed in a manner he probably wouldn't have predicted. The Soviet Union fell apart not through military defeat but economic exhaustion and loss of faith in its own ideology. Technology evolved beyond anything he'd envisioned. In 1984, the telescreens were tools of surveillance, but technology otherwise remained fairly static. Orwell didn't foresee the internet, smartphones, artificial intelligence, social media, or any of the digital infrastructure that reshaped human communication. His imagination ran toward totalitarian control, not technological revolution. Would he have grasped the implications? Hard to say. He'd shown adaptability before, updating his understanding as circumstances changed. The man who fought in Spain wasn't the same man who wrote Animal Farm 5 years later. He learned, adjusted, reconsidered. Perhaps he would have done the same with digital technology, recognizing both its liberating potential and its surveillance capabilities. The commercialization of everything might have disturbed him more than government control. He'd warned about state power, but corporate power was less central to his analysis. By the 21st century, corporations collected more data on individuals than most governments did. They shaped behaviour through algorithms and targeted advertising. The manipulation was subtler than Big Brother's, but arguably more effective because people consented to it, trading privacy for convenience. Advertising had always troubled him. He'd worked in it briefly and found it dishonest, a profession built on making people want things they didn't need. The advertising industry of his time was primitive compared to what came later. Micro-targeting, behavioural prediction, psychological profiling. These tools made mid-century advertising look crude. The goal remained the same though: manufacture desire, create dissatisfaction, sell the cure. Political language continued degrading exactly as he'd described. Perhaps it always had been degraded and he'd simply noticed. Either way, the patterns he identified in politics and the English language remained visible everywhere. Euphemisms multiplied, collateral damage instead of dead civilians, enhanced interrogation instead of torture, downsizing instead of mass firings. The vocabulary shifted, but the evasion stayed constant. Corporate speak developed its own dialect of meaninglessness: synergy, leverage, optimization, disruption. Words that sounded significant while communicating almost nothing. Orwell would have recognized this immediately as the same impulse he'd criticized in political writing: make the bad sound good, the vague sound precise, the meaningless sound profound. Social media created new forms of language decay. Character limits encouraged compression. Nuance disappeared. Complex thoughts reduced to slogans. Outrage performed for audiences. He'd predicted something like newspeak, a language deliberately impoverished to make certain thoughts impossible. What emerged was different but related. Not imposed from above, but adopted voluntarily. People limited their own vocabulary, simplified their own thoughts, because the platforms rewarded brevity and emotion over depth and precision. The culture wars of the late 20th and early 21st centuries saw all sides claiming Orwell as their champion. Conservatives quoted him against political correctness and speech codes. Progressives quoted him against corporate power and militarism. Libertarians quoted him against any form of government authority. Everyone found something useful. This wasn't necessarily misuse. His work contained multiple themes and concerns. Different readers emphasized different aspects. The problem came when people claimed he'd support their entire political program based on selective quotation. Orwell was complicated, inconsistent, evolving. He didn't fit neatly into contemporary categories because those categories hadn't existed in his lifetime. The socialist who despised Soviet communism, the patriot who criticized British imperialism, the anti-fascist who mocked leftist intellectuals. Where does this person land on a modern political spectrum? Nowhere cleanly. He'd agree with conservatives on some issues, progressives on others, libertarians on still others. Trying to conscript him into any current faction required ignoring large portions of his work. What remained consistent was his hatred of dishonesty. Political lying, intellectual fraud, the abuse of language to conceal rather than reveal. This cut across ideological lines. He attacked it wherever he found it, left or right, in service of causes he supported or opposed. The method mattered more than the content. Bad arguments for good causes were still bad arguments. His influence on other writers was enormous and often unacknowledged. The plain style he championed became standard for a certain kind of political journalism. Reporters who'd never read his essays absorbed his principles secondhand through editors who had. Say what you mean, use concrete language, avoid clichés. These seemed like common sense, but they were actually a specific tradition, one he'd helped establish. Fiction writers borrowed his techniques too. The way he embedded political themes in accessible narratives made ideology visceral through character and story. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale owed clear debts to 1984. So did countless other dystopias. He'd created a template, Some writers rejected him deliberately, finding his influence oppressive. They wanted to write politically engaged fiction that didn't follow his model, that embraced complexity and ambiguity rather than clear warnings. This was valid. Any strong influence eventually provokes reaction. The fact that writers felt they needed to escape his shadow proved how long that shadow had grown. His personal life remained difficult to discuss without voyeurism or judgment. The tuberculosis that killed him had been advancing for years. He'd ignored symptoms, pushed through illness, kept working when he should have been resting. This was partly temperament, partly necessity. He needed to finish 1984 before the disease finished him. The last years were grim. Hemorrhaging lungs, hospital stays, experimental treatments that didn't work. He married Sonia Brownell from his hospital bed in October 1949, 3 months before he died. Whether this was love, loneliness, or a desire to secure his literary estate was unclear. Probably all three. Dying people make complicated decisions. Sonia became his widow and literary executor at age 30. She spent decades managing his reputation, authorizing biographies, overseeing publications. Her role was controversial. Some thought she protected his legacy faithfully. Others felt she controlled it too tightly, suppressed materials that complicated the approved narrative. She died in 1980 without resolving these debates. The cottage on Jura, where he'd written 1984, became a pilgrimage site. Remote, difficult to reach, which somehow made it more appealing. Writers visited, stayed in the house, tried to absorb whatever atmosphere remained. Whether this helped their work was questionable, but the impulse was understandable. Physical proximity to creative achievement feels meaningful even when it probably isn't. His typewriter, his notes, his books. These objects ended up in archives and museums. People studied them like relics. The actual typewriter keys he'd struck while creating Big Brother and Winston Smith. As if the physical tools contained some trace of the creative act, some residue of genius that could be examined and understood. Biographers produced increasingly detailed accounts of his life. Every year accounted for, every article traced, every letter catalogued. This was valuable scholarship, but it created a strange effect. The more we knew about Eric Blair, the person, the more distant George Orwell, the writer, seemed to become. The legend grew harder to maintain once we understood all the human messiness behind it. He'd been difficult, occasionally cruel, certainly flawed. His attitudes toward women were often regressive, even by the standards of his time. His behavior in relationships ranged from merely selfish to genuinely harmful. He could be a bad friend, a worse husband. Learning these details didn't invalidate his work, but it complicated the simple narrative of the moral hero speaking truth to power. Perhaps that complication was healthy. Treating writers as saints made them less useful. Their work became scripture rather than something to argue with, learn from, build on. Orwell, the flawed human who sometimes wrote brilliantly, was more valuable than Orwell, the secular saint who never made mistakes. His essays remained the most direct access to his thinking. Reading them chronologically showed the evolution clearly. The young man trying out different styles and subjects. The middle period where he found his voice and themes. The late work where everything cohered into a unified vision. Not a straight line, but a progression. Why I Write laid out his motivations with typical clarity. 4 reasons: sheer egoism, aesthetic enthusiasm, historical impulse, political purpose. Most writers share the first 3. He insisted the 4th was essential, at least for his generation. Writing had to serve some purpose beyond itself. Art for art's sake was a luxury he couldn't afford. Whether this remained true for later generations was debatable. The urgency he felt, the sense that civilization was at stake, came from living through depression, fascism, war, totalitarianism. Writers born into relative peace and prosperity might not feel the same pressure. They could focus on aesthetics or personal expression without guilt. Orwell probably would have envied them while also finding their work frivolous. The tension between artistic ambition and political commitment ran through everything he wrote. He wanted to produce beautiful prose and effective propaganda simultaneously. Sometimes, these goals aligned. More often, they conflicted. The propagandistic passages in his novels tended to be the weakest artistically. The most beautiful passages sometimes undermined the political message. He never fully resolved this tension. Maybe no one could. Art and propaganda operate by different logic. Art embraces ambiguity. Propaganda demands clarity. Art shows. Propaganda tells. Art trusts readers. Propaganda directs them. Trying to combine both meant satisfying neither completely. Animal Farm came closest to succeeding. The allegory worked as both story and argument. Children could read it as a fairy tale about farm animals. Adults recognized the political critique. Multiple levels of meaning reinforced rather than contradicting each other. He'd found the perfect form for his purpose. 1984 was messier. The relationship between Winston and Julia, the world building, the atmosphere of dread. These worked brilliantly. The long excerpts from Goldstein's book and O'Brien's lectures stopped the narrative cold. He'd felt obligated to explain the ideology explicitly rather than trusting readers to infer it from events. The explanation was interesting, but it damaged the novel's pace. Critics had been arguing about this since publication. Was the book flawed, or were readers impatient? Should Orwell have cut the expository sections, or did they contain essential information? No consensus emerged because both positions had merit. The novel worked despite its structural problems, which suggested either that the problems weren't as serious as critics claimed, or that the strengths were powerful enough to overcome them. His journalism aged better than expected. Pieces written about specific 1940s political situations remained readable because he'd focused on underlying patterns rather than surface details. The particular crisis that prompted each essay was often forgotten. The analysis of how language gets corrupted or how intellectuals rationalize totalitarianism stayed relevant. Notes on nationalism described psychological patterns that appeared in every generation. Substitute different labels and the mechanisms stayed identical. The need to belong to something larger, the conviction that one's group was superior, the selective attention that ignored friendly atrocities while magnifying enemy crimes. He'd mapped the territory so precisely that readers kept rediscovering his map and finding it accurate. His collected essays ran to 4 volumes, over 2,000 pages. How many people actually read them all? Probably not many. Most encountered the greatest hits: Shooting an Elephant, A Hanging, Politics in the English Language, maybe a few others. The rest remained known more by reputation than actual reading. This was normal. Few writers get read comprehensively, except by specialists. Most readers sample, pick favourites, skip the rest. Orwell's legacy rested on perhaps a dozen works. 2 novels, 8 or 10 essays, maybe 1 or 2 book-length pieces like Homage to Catalonia. Everything else was context, background, the deep archive for scholars. The academy he founded lasted 916 years. Count them. From 387 BC until 529 AD, when Justinian closed it. No university, no institution of learning, no school of any kind has matched that record. Not Oxford, not Cambridge, not Bologna. None of them have existed even half as long. The academy outlasted the Athenian democracy that killed Socrates. It outlasted Alexander's empire, the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire itself. Emperors rose and fell. Entire civilizations collapsed. Languages died. The academy continued, teaching mathematics and philosophy in the same olive grove where Plato had walked. Think about what that continuity meant. a student in 200 AD studying at the academy, was learning in the direct institutional line from Plato himself. 12 generations of teachers had passed the tradition down. The connection was unbroken. When the doors finally closed, it wasn't because the school had failed or become irrelevant. It was shut by force, by imperial decree, because Christian authorities recognized it as a threat to orthodoxy. 7 of the last Neoplatonist philosophers, finding Athens intolerable under Christian rule, fled to Persia. They carried manuscripts with them. The Persian king Khosrow I welcomed them. They established a philosophical community in exile, teaching, writing, preserving what they could. Eventually, some returned to the empire under a negotiated agreement. Others stayed. The tradition scattered but didn't die. It went underground, resurfaced in unexpected places, transformed into new forms. Arabic philosophers encountered Plato through translations. Al-Farabi wrote commentaries. Avicenna incorporated Platonic metaphysics into Islamic philosophy. These weren't antiquarian exercises. They were living engagements with active questions. The forms, the immortal soul, the nature of knowledge. Muslim thinkers found these doctrines compelling and built elaborate philosophical systems around them. When those Arabic texts were translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, Plato returned to Western Europe through a strange loop. Christian scholars reading Muslim philosophers reading Greek originals. Each layer added interpretation, distortion, insight. By the time the chain completed, Plato had become something different than he'd been in Athens, but the core questions remained recognizable. Does the persistence prove anything about truth? Not necessarily. Bad ideas can persist as long as good ones, if they're useful or compelling or adaptable enough. Astrology lasted millennia without being true. But philosophy isn't astrology. The questions Plato raised don't have the same relationship to truth and falsehood. Asking, what is justice, isn't like predicting planetary influences. The question itself is the point, not any particular answer. Modern philosophy departments have complicated relationships with Plato. Everyone reads him. No one can avoid him. But contemporary philosophers often treat him as historical background rather than living interlocutor. You study Plato to understand where philosophy came from, not necessarily to find solutions to current problems. The theory of forms gets presented as an interesting historical doctrine that almost no one believes anymore. Yet the questions keep recurring. Mathematicians still debate whether they're discovering or inventing. That's the Platonic question, even when Plato isn't mentioned. Ethicists argue about whether moral truths are objective or constructed. Plato's shadow again. Political theorists design ideal institutions, then face the implementation problem. The Republic's central dilemma in modern dress. Language itself preserves his influence in ways we don't notice. The word idea comes from the Greek word Plato, used for forms, eidos. When we talk about ideas, we're using vocabulary that originally referred to eternal transcendent realities. The meaning has shifted, become more psychological, more subjective, but the word carries its history with it. Every time someone says, "I have an idea," there's a distant echo of Platonic metaphysics. Platonic love entered common speech but lost precision in the process. Most people use it to mean non-sexual affection. That's not wrong exactly, but it misses the philosophical content. The ladder of love from physical beauty to the form of beauty itself. The transformation of desire into contemplation. That's what Plato meant. The popular usage keeps the name while discarding the theory. How much does it matter whether anyone remembers the original meaning? Languages evolve, concepts drift. We don't need to understand Plato's theory to use words derived from it, but something gets lost in the forgetting. The depth behind the terminology, the careful thinking that produced these concepts. When everything becomes vague and fuzzy, When Platonic just means not romantic, we lose access to the precision that made the term useful in the first place. The cave allegory appears constantly in popular culture, usually without attribution. Any story about someone discovering that their reality is false and breaking free follows the pattern. The Matrix made it explicit. Morpheus offers Neo the red pill and says, "Welcome to the real world." That's the prisoner leaving the cave. The movie even has Neo return to free others, just like the philosopher must return to help those still trapped. The Wachowskis knew exactly what they were doing. They were remaking Plato for a digital age. But here's what's strange. The allegory works even for people who've never heard of Plato. The structure is powerful enough to function independently. You don't need to know the source to feel the force of the story. Does that mean Plato discovered something universal about human experience? Or that his story was so influential, it shaped how we think about enlightenment and liberation? Probably both. The best ideas are the ones that feel obvious once you hear them, as if you'd always known them but needed someone to articulate what you couldn't express yourself. His influence on Christianity created particular ironies. The religion that eventually shut down the academy had absorbed enormous amounts of Platonic philosophy. Augustine couldn't have built his theology without Platonic foundations. The forms became divine ideas. The soul's journey became salvation history. The cave allegory became the story of humanity before and after Christ. Plato was baptized, made safe for Christian consumption, by removing the parts that contradicted revelation and keeping everything compatible. This produced centuries of confusion about what Plato actually taught versus what Christian Platonism taught. Medieval scholars read Plato through so many layers of interpretation, they sometimes couldn't see the original underneath. When Renaissance humanists returned to the Greek texts, they were shocked by how different the real Plato was from the one they'd inherited through tradition. And yet the Christian appropriation wasn't entirely dishonest. Plato's philosophy did point toward monotheism, toward transcendence, toward the immortality of the soul. The form of the good functioned like God in many ways. You could read the dialogues as preparation for revelation without completely violating the text. The fit wasn't perfect, but it was close enough that intelligent people could convince themselves it was seamless. The political legacy remains contested and probably always will be. Is Plato the father of totalitarianism or a misunderstood advocate for justice? The Republic describes a society with no privacy, no individual freedom, total state control over education and reproduction. It abolishes the family. It requires a noble lie to function. These are totalitarian features. Popper wasn't wrong to be alarmed, but context matters. Plato was responding to the chaos and injustice of Athenian democracy. He'd watched his city lose a catastrophic war, slide into civil war, execute his teacher. The Republic was written by someone who'd seen democracy at its worst. The philosopher king was meant to be the answer to mob rule, to the problem of unqualified people making decisions about things they didn't understand. Was he wrong? Democracies do make terrible decisions. Crowds are manipulable. Demagogues do exploit popular ignorance. The problem is that philosopher kings don't exist, or when they do, they're not immortal. Plato's system required permanently wise, permanently virtuous rulers who never became corrupted by power. This is fantasy. Power corrupts even philosophers, maybe especially philosophers who can rationalize their corruption as being for the greater good. The blueprint for utopia becomes the blueprint for nightmare the moment ordinary humans try to implement it. Perhaps Plato knew this. Perhaps the Republic was never meant as practical political advice, but as a thought experiment. What would perfect justice look like? Here's the description. Now realize how impossible it is. Now understand why actual politics must settle for less. Reading it as warning rather than recommendation changes everything. His actual political involvement ended in disaster every time. The 3 trips to Syracuse, each worse than the last, the attempt to educate Dionysius II, the enslavement, the imprisonment, Dion's assassination, all of it proved that philosophy and tyranny don't mix. The wise cannot rule, and rulers won't be wise. He learned this through painful experience, but never quite accepted the lesson. Some part of him kept hoping that reason could triumph over power if only the circumstances were right. They never were, they never are. This is the tragedy at the heart of Plato's life. He had the intellectual tools to understand why his political project was doomed, but the emotional investment that kept him trying anyway. Dion's letters would arrive, and he'd sail to Sicily again, despite knowing it was futile. Love and loyalty and hope overpowered rational calculation. For someone who built his philosophy on reason ruling the soul, this must have been bitter. The dialogues became his real political project, not governing Syracuse, but governing minds, not changing institutions, but changing how people think about institutions. This was slower, less dramatic, harder to measure, but the effects were deeper and lasted longer. The Academy produced no philosopher kings, but it produced generations of people who asked philosophical questions about politics. That was worth something. His students scattered across the Greek world. They founded schools, advised rulers, taught the next generation. The methods spread. The questions spread. Slowly, incrementally, the examined life became a recognized alternative to the unexamined one. Not that most people chose it. Most never would. But the option existed. The possibility existed. That was new. Aristotle leaving to found the Lyceum created rivalry, but also expansion. Now there were 2 major philosophical schools in Athens, competing, disagreeing, pushing each other. The Stoics came later, then the Epicureans. Athens became a city of philosophers, a place where systematic thinking about fundamental questions was normal. Plato started that. The Academy was the seed that grew into an entire ecosystem. His writing created the philosophical dialogue as a literary form. Before Plato, philosophy was poetry or prose treatise. After Plato, it could be dramatic conversation. This wasn't just stylistic innovation. The form carried philosophical content. Truth emerges through dialogue, through question and answer, through multiple perspectives colliding. You can't get it from monologue or assertion. The form embodied the method. Later, philosophers mostly abandoned the dialogue format. Aristotle wrote treatises, the Stoics wrote treatises, the medieval scholastics wrote systematic theology. The dialogue seemed like a Platonic peculiarity, brilliant but not imitable. But the method survived even when the form didn't. The Socratic questioning, the refusal to accept easy answers, the demand for definitions and logical consistency. These became standard philosophical practice. Teaching philosophy today still means teaching how to question effectively, how to spot assumptions, how to test arguments, how to distinguish good reasoning from bad. This is Socratic method even when Socrates isn't mentioned. The practice has become so naturalized, we forget it had to be invented. Someone had to show that this was possible, that systematic questioning could be a path to wisdom. Plato, recording Socrates, did that. The immortality he achieved wasn't the one he expected. He believed in literal immortality, the soul surviving death and being reincarnated or escaping to the realm of forms. We have no evidence this happens. The immortality he got was the kind he didn't emphasize. His words survived, his questions survived, his influence survived. 24 centuries later, people still read the dialogues, still argue about the forms, still wonder whether philosopher kings are possible. That's not nothing. Most humans leave no trace. Even most philosophers are forgotten within generations. Their books go out of print, their ideas get absorbed into the general background, or discarded as irrelevant. To remain a living presence across millennia, to still be read, and debated and taught. This is rare. Plato achieved it not through political power or military conquest, but through thought and writing. The pen really did prove mightier than the sword, at least in his case. The question he asked in the courtroom that day, watching Socrates condemned, never got a final answer. What is justice? The Republic offered one response, the laws offered another. The other dialogues circled it from different angles, but no dialogue ends with Socrates saying, "There, that's settled." The question remains open. Maybe that's the point. Maybe justice is something we approach, but never fully grasp, something we must keep questioning, rather than assuming we've figured out. Socrates died for asking questions. Plato spent his life ensuring those questions would never stop being asked. That was his answer to the injustice. Not revenge, not despair, but the creation of something permanent. The academy, the dialogues, the philosophical tradition. These were his response to hemlock and democratic mobs and the death of wisdom. He couldn't save his teacher, but he could save what his teacher represented. The examined life, the pursuit of truth, the refusal to accept inherited answers without testing them first. In the olive grove outside Athens, students still walk, not literally. The academy is ruins, but mentally, philosophically, every person who stops to question their assumptions walks that path. Every classroom where genuine inquiry happens is the academy reopened. Every mind that refuses easy certainty is a student of Plato's school. The shadows still dance on the cave wall. Most people still watch them thinking that's reality. But some turn their heads, some see the fire, some make the difficult journey upward into the light. And when they do, they're following the path Plato mapped 24 centuries ago, walking out of the cave toward the sun. That's the complete story. The young aristocrat who watched his teacher die. The failed novelist who found his voice documenting poverty. The colonial policeman consumed by guilt. The soldier shot in the throat fighting fascists. The propagandist who hated propaganda. The dying man racing to finish his warning. Orwell's 80 decades weren't enough. He needed more time, more books unwritten, more essays unfinished, more warnings undelivered. But tuberculosis doesn't negotiate. The body fails regardless of how much work remains. He got 46 years and used them completely. The questions he forced us to confront haven't gone anywhere. Is truth objective, or just another form of power? Can language be trusted, or is it always being corrupted? Do we control technology, or does it control us? These weren't abstract puzzles for Orwell. They were survival questions. Get them wrong, and you end up in room 101. His grave sits in that quiet churchyard. Eric Blair, not George Orwell. The name he was born with, not the one he made famous. Most visitors looking for Orwell walk right past it. They're searching for the wrong name on the headstone. There's something fitting about that. The man and the legend never quite aligned. The complicated human and the moral icon remained separate. What would he make of being taught in schools, required reading the establishment figure? Probably horrified. He'd spent his life attacking orthodoxy and became one himself. The rebel turned into curriculum. The warning turned into homework. Students reading 1984. Because they have to, not because it's dangerous. That's its own kind of doublethink. But some of those students look up from the assigned pages and recognize something true. They see the mechanisms he described operating in their own world. Different packaging, same machinery. The surveillance is corporate, not governmental. The propaganda is algorithmic, not bureaucratic. The 2 minutes hate happens on social media, not in assembly halls. But the patterns Orwell identified still function. That recognition matters more than perfect prediction. He wasn't trying to forecast the future. He was illuminating the present by pushing its logic to extremes. If these trends continue, if we don't resist, here's where we end up. The warning worked precisely because it was heeded. We didn't get 1984's world because enough people read the book and said no. The tools he gave us remain sharp. When politicians abuse language, someone notices and calls it Orwellian. When surveillance expands, someone invokes Big Brother. When truth becomes contested, someone remembers 2 + 2 = 4. These references have become clichés through overuse. But clichés exist because the underlying truth keeps being relevant. We need the vocabulary he provided because the problems he named haven't disappeared. His commitment to clarity, to saying what he meant as precisely as possible, stands as permanent rebuke to everyone who hides behind jargon and abstraction. The 6 rules still work. Cut unnecessary words. Use simple language. Avoid clichés. Say what you mean. These aren't just style tips, they're ethical principles. Clear writing is honest writing. Obscurity enables lying. The poverty he chose. The bullet he took. The books nobody wanted. The success that came too late. The son who barely knew him. The wife who died before seeing his triumph. The lungs that failed before the work was finished. None of it was fair. None of it was just. He deserved better and got tuberculosis and a cold island and a race against death. But he finished. The manuscript reached the publisher. The warning was delivered. 1984 got printed and read and translated and taught and absorbed into culture. Animal Farm became the clearest explanation of how revolutions devour themselves. The essays remained sharp and relevant. The work survived. That survival wasn't guaranteed. Books go out of print, reputations fade, new writers replace old ones. But Orwell's writing had something that kept it alive, not perfection. His novels had flaws, his arguments sometimes oversimplified. His blind spots were real, but the core remained solid. He'd seen something true about power and language and manipulation. He'd described it clearly, and those descriptions remained useful long after the specific circumstances that prompted them had changed. Every generation discovers him new. The 50s read him as Cold War prophet, the 60s as anti-establishment rebel, the 80s as conservative vindicated, the 21st century as surveillance critic. Each reading emphasizes different aspects. Each finds what it needs. The text accommodates these interpretations because Orwell wrote about fundamentals, not particulars. The mechanisms of control, not just specific totalitarian regimes. His isolation was the price. No party wanted him. No movement claimed him comfortably. He criticized everyone, which meant everyone had reasons to resent him. The socialists hated his attacks on Soviet Russia. The conservatives hated his advocacy for economic equality. The pacifists hated his insistence that sometimes you had to fight. The militarists hated his exposure of war's propaganda. He made enemies in all directions, but that isolation was also his strength. Not being captured by any faction meant not being limited by any faction's orthodoxy. He could see what partisans couldn't, because he wasn't invested in protecting any side's mythology. The truth mattered more than loyalty. This made him difficult and lonely, but also valuable in ways comfortable intellectuals could never be. The cottage on Jura, where he finished 1984, still stands. Remote, cold, uncomfortable. You can visit if you're determined enough. Sit where he sat. Look out at the same grey water. Imagine coughing up blood while typing about thought crime. The atmosphere is oppressive. The isolation absolute. Perfect conditions for writing dystopia. Terrible conditions for staying alive. He knew he was dying. Every cough reminded him. Every page was written against the clock. The urgency shows in the prose. No wasted words, no leisurely development. Everything essential, compressed, intense. He didn't have time for anything else. The race between completion and death drove every sentence. Death won in terms of his body. The tuberculosis progressed. The treatments failed. The lungs filled with blood. 46 years wasn't enough. But he finished the manuscript first. That matters. The work survived even though the man didn't. The warning reached readers, the questions got asked, the vocabulary entered the culture. His son Richard lived into his 70s, died in 2023. He spent his whole life being asked about a father he couldn't remember. The interviews must have been exhausting. What was Orwell really like? What would he think of current events? Richard didn't know. He was barely 2 when his father died. The man everyone wanted him to explain was a stranger to him. That absence echoes through everything. The father who adopted a son, then disappeared into tuberculosis. The husband who married on his deathbed. The writer who achieved success just in time to not enjoy it. Orwell's life was full of near misses and bad timing. He deserved more luck and got less. The unfairness was cosmic, but measuring lives purely by years lived misses something. 46 years producing that body of work matters more than 80 years producing nothing. Quality of output, not length of existence. Orwell packed more insight and influence into his shortened life than most people would manage in a century. The tuberculosis killed him young, but it didn't prevent his work. Maybe it sharpened it. Knowing time was limited focused him wonderfully. The grave in Sutton Courtenay gets visitors. Not crowds, but steady traffic. People leave flowers. They stand quietly. Some probably haven't read his books, just know the name. Others have read everything, know the work intimately. Both types of visitor come for the same reason: to acknowledge debt, to mark respect, to connect with someone who mattered. What would he want on the headstone? Probably nothing. He was suspicious of monuments and public commemoration. The simple marker with his birth name suited him better than any grand memorial. Eric Blair, born 1903, died 1950. The dates contain everything. The life lived between them created the work. That's sufficient. The work keeps circulating. New editions, new translations, new readers. Students encounter Animal Farm at 13 and 1984 at 16. Some bounce off them, find them boring or depressing. Others feel recognition, see their own world reflected. Those readers carry Orwell forward. They quote him in arguments. They reference him in essays. They teach him to the next generation. That transmission is how writers survive. Not through monuments, but through readers. Each person who picks up homage to Catalonia or politics and the English language extends Orwell's life a little further. The conversation continues. The questions remain alive. The examined life gets chosen again by someone new. His warning about totalitarianism proved useful enough that we're still deploying it. Every time someone says that's Orwellian, they're using the vocabulary he created. The phrase has power because everyone knows what it means. Big Brother, thought crime, doublethink, newspeak. These terms named things that needed names. Without them, we'd be struggling to articulate what we could sense but not express. Language shapes thought. Orwell knew this. He built his entire critique around it. Control language and you control what people can think. Expand language and you expand possible thoughts. His contribution wasn't just warning about linguistic impoverishment. He enriched the language himself, gave us words for recognizing manipulation, made certain forms of abuse visible by naming them clearly. The tuberculosis that killed him was probably inevitable, given how he'd lived. Years of poverty, bad nutrition, inadequate housing, the lungs damaged by that freezing cottage in Jura, the body worn down by overwork and stress. He'd treated himself as expendable, used himself up in service of the work. The price came due at 46. Some people die too young, their potential unrealized, their work unfinished. Orwell died young, but not too young. He'd said what he needed to say. The essential work was done. Animal Farm and 1984 were written. The major essays existed. The warning was delivered. More years would have produced more books, certainly, but the core achievement was complete. That completion matters. He didn't leave us wondering what he might have written. We know what he wrote. The body of work exists, available, readable. Everything essential made it from his mind to the page before the tuberculosis finished him. That's not luck. That's determination. Typing with failing hands. Working through pain and exhaustion, refusing to stop until the manuscript was done. The final image is him in that hospital bed, married 3 months earlier to a woman 30 years younger. Lungs failing, reading reviews of 1984. Success finally arriving, readers responding, critics recognizing the achievement, and no time left to enjoy it. The cruelty of that timing is almost literary. The recognition coming too late, the victory hollow because death was already winning. But maybe he didn't need the recognition. Maybe the work itself was sufficient. He'd written what needed writing. Whether people understood it immediately or took decades to appreciate it was beyond his control. The books existed. They'd find their readers eventually. His job was writing them. Everything after that was someone else's problem. The last words he wrote are lost to history. No dramatic final statement, no deathbed wisdom. Just a man dying of tuberculosis in a London hospital, lungs filling with blood, slipping away. The ending was medical, not literary. Bodies fail. That's biology, not drama. But the work remained. The dialogues Plato wrote, the essays Orwell produced, the questions both men forced us to confront. What is justice? What is truth? How should we live? These questions don't get final answers. Each generation approaches them fresh, finds their own responses, argues with previous generations' conclusions. That argument is the point. The examined life isn't about reaching final certainty. It's about continuing to examine, continuing to question, continuing to think, rather than accepting inherited answers. Both men knew this. Both created work designed to provoke thought rather than end it. The Cave Allegory and Room 101, The Philosopher King and Big Brother, The Forms and Newspeak, different vocabularies for similar concerns. How do we know what's real? Who should have power? What happens when language fails? The questions connect across 24 centuries because they're permanent human questions. Plato's Academy lasted 9 centuries. Orwell's work has lasted 7 decades. Both continue because the questions they raised remain urgent. Justice, truth, power, language. These aren't solved problems. They're permanent challenges. Each generation must grapple with them using whatever tools their moment provides. The tools Plato and Orwell provided remain sharp, clear thinking, precise language, willingness to question authority, refusal to accept comfortable lies. These aren't dated techniques. They're always relevant because manipulation and self-deception are always present. The grave markers are simple. Plato's somewhere lost to history. Orwell's in a country churchyard. Neither needed monuments. The work was the monument. The books that survived, the questions that remained, the influence that spread through centuries of readers. That influence continues. Right now, someone's reading The Republic for the first time. Someone else is teaching 1984 to teenagers. Someone's quoting politics and the English language in an argument about clear writing. The conversation these men started hasn't ended. It can't end as long as people still care about justice and truth. The examined life is not worth living. Socrates said it. Plato recorded it. Orwell embodied it. That principle connects them across millennia. The refusal to sleepwalk through existence. The commitment to thinking clearly about what matters. The courage to question rather than accept. Most people never examine their lives. They inherit beliefs, follow conventions, accept what they're told. That's normal. That's human. Examination is difficult, often painful, frequently isolating, but the alternative is worse. Living unthinkingly means being manipulated easily. Accepting inherited wisdom means never developing your own. Following the crowd means never choosing your own direction. Both men paid prices for examination. Socrates got hemlock, Plato got exile and slavery attempts, Orwell got poverty, and bullets and tuberculosis. The examined life isn't safe or comfortable, but they'd all argue it's the only life worth living. Better to think and suffer than coast unthinkingly to the grave. The questions remain. What is justice? What is truth? How should we live? Who should rule? How do we recognize manipulation? What makes language honest? These aren't rhetorical. They're genuine. Each reader must answer them personally, must examine their own life, must choose whether to stay in the cave or climb toward the light. Plato and Orwell can't answer for us. They can only show us the questions and demonstrate what examining them looks like. The rest is our work, our examination, our choice. The long shadow stretches forward from Athens. It passes through Jura. It reaches here, now, whoever you're reading this. The questions are yours. The examination is yours. The choice is yours.